Welcome into Mock Trial Masterclass, your guide to controlling the courtroom. I'm Luke and I want you to be a mock trial master. Let's talk about how you can make that happen. One of the most exciting parts of any trial is cross-examination. As an attorney, it's your chance to be the star of the show, to stand out, to let your score get really high. To do it effectively though, you gotta follow some rules, and that's what we're gonna talk about in this video. Specifically, I'm gonna give you 3 rules that you need to follow to have an effective cross-examination. Before we hop in, if there's any other topics you want me to address on the channel moving forward, leave a comment below letting me know what you want to hear. I love making the videos and podcasts that you guys are interested in. All right, 3 rules for a great cross-examination. Ready to hop in? Let's do it. Rule number 1 for a great cross-examination, ask only leading questions without fillers. Ask only leading questions without fillers. If you really think about it, this rule is kind of like 2 rules crammed into one. It's telling you 2 very important things about the format of the questions that you ask in cross. Let's tackle each side of the equation one at a time. Let's start with leading questions. As you probably know, if you've been around mock trial for any length of time, there are 2 types of questions you can ask a witness. You can ask a witness open-ended questions that often start with who, what, when, where, why, and how, that allow the witness to kind of steal the show and take ownership of their answer. They can take any direction they please because it's an open-ended question. Close-ended or leading questions, on the other hand, are closed, right? It's suggested by the name. They don't leave a whole lot of wiggle room. They suggest the answer to the question, and they point the witness exactly to where you want them to go. And for an effective cross-examination, every single question you ask must be a leading question. You know, sometimes in direct examination, where it's best to ask open-ended, you can get away with a leading question every now and then. What I teach my students is that in cross-examination, there is no reason to ever be asking an open-ended question. Your number 1 job as an attorney on cross is to control the courtroom, and it's really hard to do that if you ask an open-ended question, which is why everything you ask a witness on cross must be close-ended, must be a leading question. It must suggest the answer. What does that mean? Well, it means instead of asking, where did you go on Saturday? You tell the witness, you went here on Saturday. Right? It means if you're putting an exhibit into evidence with the witness, you don't say, do you recognize this? You say, no, you recognize this. And if you're conducting an impeachment with the witness, you don't say, is this your affidavit? Do you recognize it? No, this is your affidavit. Were you sworn? No, you were sworn. You were under oath. That's the difference you're looking for when asking leading questions on cross. The second part of this rule, ask leading questions and don't use fillers. What's a filler? Well, those are those little things you throw in at the end of the question to kind of sound like a lawyer. You know, isn't that true? Isn't that correct? What I teach my students every single year is that you never need those little phrases. You don't need them. Sure, maybe if the witness is sitting up on the stand and they're being difficult, you might throw a correct at them in order to direct them back to where you want them to go. But for the most part, you don't need that stuff. It's just not necessary. The reason it's not necessary is because a cross-examination, if it's the way it should be, is really just a conversation between you and the jury that the witness occasionally interrupts with a yes. It's fun to think of it that way. So instead of asking, you went outside yesterday morning, isn't that true? Or you went outside on Friday, isn't that correct? I'm just going to say, you went outside Friday. And the witness is going to know what to do. If they don't, push them in the direction they need to go. But as a general rule, only leading questions and no fillers on cross-examination. It's going to make your questions that much more precise, that much clearer, and it's going to help you maintain the level of control that you need to for an effective cross. Rule number 2 for an effective cross-examination is you have to re-control the narrative. Think about the context that your typical cross is happening in. The witness has just been through direct examination where an attorney who is their teammate brings out facts that are friendly to their side of the case. The jury has just been sitting there listening to this for a while, and they're probably starting to think, yeah, this guy or this gal has got some good points. It's your job to turn that on its head and recontrol the narrative. Where this really comes into play with a good cross is the content of the questions that you ask. This is what I'm thinking about when I'm writing my cross-examination, when I'm preparing the actual questions that I'm going to ask, the directions I'm going to go with the witness. I'm asking myself, are these questions that are going to help me recontrol the narrative and help me flip the case back toward my side? What are some examples of things that do that? Well, one example is if you can point out bias in the witness. In an extreme case, maybe they're, best friends with the defendant and they're testifying for the defense. Maybe they're an expert witness who has something really big to gain from the trial. There's all sorts of things that play into bias in a mock trial. Process. If it's an expert, you're questioning them on their scientific process. If it's a lay witness, a non-expert, the process they took to get the information they have. If they're giving you things that they witnessed with their eyes, maybe you talk about the fact that they were really far away if that's in your case packet. Their process is always going to matter. It's always going to help you recontrol the narrative. You're also going to want to talk about the things that they didn't go into on direct, the things that attorney that they were dealing with probably didn't want to have to talk about because they benefit your side a whole lot more than the other side. And that's such a huge part of cross-examination. I remember being in college and crossing a witness on things that they didn't talk about in direct, and the other attorney stood up and said, "Objection, Your Honor, he's talking about things that we didn't go over in direct." And I just kind of looked at the judge and I said, "Your Honor, that's not how this works. It's kind of what I'm supposed to do." And the judge was like, "Yes, Mr. Worsham, that's what you're supposed to do in cross, because it is what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to recontrol the narrative, and there are a lot of different ways to do that, but you need to remember that your primary job when sculpting questions and thinking about what type of content you're going to get into in your cross is to bring that story, bring the facts back to your side where they can benefit you in your case." Before we get into the third and final rule for a great cross, I want to let you know that my book, Mock Trial Masterclass, is available on Amazon. This is a book that students and coaches all over the country have used to develop their skills, and it's a great place to go if you're just getting started in mock trial or if you're a veteran who wants to sharpen your toolbox just a little bit. It goes over everything you need to succeed as an attorney, and you can pick up a copy by clicking the link in the show notes on YouTube or on podcast platforms. Third and final rule for a great cross-examination, you have to know when to quit. You got to know when to quit. Some of the worst cross-examinations I've ever seen featured awesome questions, powerhouse performance from the attorney in the sense of they looked like they were in control, they were very articulate, they were interesting to listen to, but then it just never ended. It seemed to go on and on and on for an eternity. That's what you have to avoid if you want a great cross-examination. You have to know when to quit. If you could be up there all day long, man, that would be so much fun, right? Just trashing the witness and talking about all these things. But A, you have a time limit, right? And then B, the jury just stops paying attention at a certain point. They start losing interest at a certain point. And so your job as an attorney on cross is to know when to quit. How do you know when to quit? Well, I teach my students 3 signs to look for to know when it's time to quit on cross-examination. Sign number 1 is that you're tempted to ask a home run question. Home run questions are the big, exciting questions that you hear lawyers on television courtroom dramas ask. Things like, "Well, you're biased, aren't you?" And, "Well, then you're actually the one that did it, weren't you?" And then the witness cries, is like, "Yes, it was me." That doesn't happen in mock trial. It shouldn't happen in mock trial. Because here's the thing, if you ask a question like that in mock trial, you're not going to get the answer you're looking for. No student on the other team is going to start breaking into tears and confessing on the witness stand. So when you want to ask a question like that, it's a good sign to stop. Because here's the thing, most of the time, the questions that you've asked leading up to that point make the point that you're trying to make. Let me give you an example. You're crossing someone who is testifying for the defense, who is best friends with the defendant. Okay, they're clearly biased, right? And so you start asking questions like, you're best friends with the defendant. You've actually been on vacation with them very recently. You grew up together, you text all the time, you FaceTime all the time. You're very, very close. Right? You ask those questions, the jury is seeing in their head, "Oh, wow, this guy's biased. I don't know that I want to listen to him." They're going there for you, I promise. They're listening, they're focusing, they can understand where you're going. You don't need to ask that last home run question of, so you're biased, aren't you, right? Because no witness is going to be like, yeah, I'm biased, right? No, that's not going to happen. But also the jury has already picked up where you're going. So if you're tempted to ask a home run question, time to quit, time to sit down most of the time. Another way to know that it's time to quit is if you feel like you're beating a dead horse, or if you start to just kind of make the same point over and over again. I see attorneys all the time in cross. They have a very powerful point, and they know it's powerful, and they make it very effectively. And in their head, they're like, I love this so much, I'm going to do it again. And so they start asking like rephrased versions of the questions they've already asked. And usually this just amounts to an asked and answered objection that gets sustained, and the attorney awkwardly has to move on to their next line of questions, right? Don't do that. If you have such an effective point that is so good that you're tempted to repeat it because you know it's that good, that's not a sign to repeat it. That's a sign to stop because you've done your job. The third sign that I would say to look for to know when it's time to quit on cross-examination is when you get a really bad line or a bad answer from a witness. Sometimes if you're listening very closely, witnesses on the stand will give you horrible answers to the questions that you ask, in the sense of horrible for them, makes their side of the case look really, really bad. When you get an answer like that, don't keep digging. Pause for a second, let that bad answer really sink into the room, and then sit down, because you're done at that point. You got nothing left to prove once that happens. But that's what it looks like for a good cross-examination. Now, there's more details that go into it, and I've got other videos on mistakes to avoid in cross-examination and what it looks like to write a good cross. But if you just keep those 3 rules in mind, you're going to be in great shape on cross.